Welcome to USEM, Unified Security Exposure Management. This is the next generation of vulnerability response. Today, we'll be walking you through some of the key enhancements that USEM brings to ServiceNow. We'll be looking at how we manage different types of exposures within one unified experience. We'll explore some of the new enhancements, the new user interfaces, and how we've simplified managing configurations, integrations, and more with USEM. Carla Jackson, our vulnerability analyst, has launched the brand new Security Exposure Management Workspace. On this landing page, Carla is presented with findings across her organization. These findings may span application vulnerabilities, container vulnerabilities, host infrastructure vulnerabilities, as well as misconfigurations. The findings are broken down in several reports. For example, risk and exposure, I can look at my findings based on the risk to the business, the sources of the findings. On the remediation progress, we can see findings that are perhaps in a deferred or exception lifecycle, the top teams that are assigned findings, how we are doing with regards to remediation status, have we breached our remediation target date, are we in flight, the state, and more. We can also see the findings broken down by the assets. We can see the type of assets within our organization that have a finding on them, the cloud resource, and more. Powered by Now Assist for vulnerability response, we also have the ability to generate AI-driven insights for the visualizations on the dashboard. The AI-driven insights give us details around patterns of findings, where we have time-sensitive issues, and where we can apply effort to reduce the most risk in the business. Carla is also able to further filter the findings presented on the homepage. For example, let's take a look at our container and infrastructure findings. Now that I've narrowed my view into the flavors or the types of exposures I care about, I can further apply additional filters. For example, let's review the exposures where an exploit exists. From here, I've narrowed down my view into findings across container and infrastructure vulnerabilities where an exploit exists. We can take a look at the various reports, and we can also generate AI-driven insights powered by Now Assist for VR. I'm now presented with AI-driven insights across the findings that meet my filtering conditions. I can see across container and infrastructure vulnerabilities where an exploit exists, time-sensitive issues, patterns, and where I need to apply effort to reduce risk. Where Carla or the security team has a need to apply their own conditions, their own queries for these reports, they can leverage the experience here. For example, they can click the plus icon, and perhaps Carla is interested in exposures that are on the CISA-KEV and have breached the remediation target date. We then select the exposure type that we want our reports to filter on. For example, application vulnerabilities, container vulnerabilities, and infrastructure vulnerabilities. Now that I have the types of exposures that I want to report on, we can add our condition. We'll create our filter based on the remediation status field is target missed. We'll add an and condition and filter on vulnerability CISA-KEV field. CISA-KEV is true. We'll then ensure that this refreshes. And now I can create my own tailored view of exposures based on the type of exposure and the conditions I specify, such as remediation status is target missed and the vulnerability is associated with the CISA-KEV. Additionally, Carla and the security team can also modify and edit the filters that are used as well. For example, I can come in and modify the all active findings or have a quick glance at what is behind this particular filter. Let's now review the experience with Kevin Holmes, our IT remediation owner. Kevin also launches the Security Exposure Management Workspace. Kevin is presented with a tailored experience using the same Security Exposure Management Workspace. He has a breakdown of the particular remediation tasks, the actual findings that are assigned to his teams, as well as assets that are related to findings that are assigned to his team. Remediation teams using this experience also have access to reports that show the remediation tasks assigned to their teams. These are broken down by the remediation status. Have we missed our target dates? Are we in flight? As well as the state of those tasks and the risk rating of those tasks. Remediation teams can also leverage the quick filters to view particular remediation tasks based on the exposure type. For example, application vulnerability response, container vulnerability response, host infrastructure vulnerability response, as well as remediation tasks tied to configuration compliance. On the Findings tab, remediation teams are presented with a view of the findings that are assigned to their teams. They can see this with quick reports broken down by the types of assets or configuration items, the state of the findings, as well as the risk rating of those findings. They can further come down here and interact with the findings based on the exposure type. Lastly, the remediation teams have access to the assets. They can take a look at the types of assets that are impacted by findings that have been assigned to their team. They can see the assets broken down by the type, by the risk rating, and accessibility of the asset being internet facing or not. Down below, we can see the actual assets or configuration items, as well as a rolled up risk score based on the number and the type of findings for each particular asset. Kevin and the remediation users can then also drill into the particular records themselves. For example, let's take a look at a remediation task tied to an application vulnerability. Kevin and the remediation teams can review the associated vulnerable items under that remediation task, high-level details of the remediation task, and also start to take action on this remediation task. For example, creating a change request, creating an exception request, and so forth. Let's now pivot our experience using Andrew Taylor, our Enterprise Risk Manager. Andrew is responsible for reviewing and approving or rejecting exception requests for his organization. Andrew launches the Security Exposure Management Workspace, and on the Workspace navigation, Andrew clicks on the Approvals button. We're presented with quick reports at the top where we can see approval requests that have come in, requests that are pending approval, the types of approval requests, approvals requiring my attention, and all approvals in the queue. I can use the report and drill in to quickly see the related records. From the list below, I can see all of the exception requests that are pending action. I also have top-level details such as the type of exception request and the flavor of the exception request. For example, mitigating control in place. Let's take a look at one of these exception requests. Upon clicking the exception request record, I have at a glance high-level details of the exception request, details about the risk at hand, and the scope of the exception request, such as how many assets or configuration items are impacted, how many findings are in scope, and so forth. To the right side of my screen, I am presented with AI-generated insights powered by Now Assist for VR. As an exception approver, this is extremely valuable. I'm presented with summarized details around the risk at hand. For example, the request I'm approving happens to be related to a very dangerous vulnerability with a high exploit prediction score. I can see that we've breached our remediation status. No compensating controls have been associated to this exception request. And I can use these details and the recommendation to make my decisions with confidence. We'll proceed to reject this exception request. We'll add a comment and send this back to the requester. Let's go back to our list of in-flight exception requests and review another example. We have our high-level details of the exception request, the scope of the exception request, and we can now see, based on the AI-generated insights, details to help me make my decision. For example, a clear justification has been provided with an action plan to remediate this exposure within an appropriate amount of time. And the impact to the business is within our risk appetite. We can proceed to make our decision with confidence. We'll approve this exception request. We'll add a comment here to complete this, and we'll go ahead and approve. We can review the details that have an audit trail showing that Andrew has approved this exception request. Let's now pivot back to Carla, who also assumes our role of a USEM administrator. From the workspace experience, we'll go ahead and click the settings or the gear icon. The USEM administrators can manage and configure all of the related integrations directly from within the workspace experience. The USEM admins also have quick details around the health of the integrations. For example, if the integration has recently ran, or if we had an error on the most recent run, and our USEM admins can go ahead and click the review icon for more details. In addition to managing the integrations, our USEM admins also have access to all of the core USEM configurations. These configurations are all managed from within one unified experience. Let's take a look at one of our core USEM configurations, specifically the assignment rules. When I click the review button, I am presented with the listing of all of our assignment rules. The assignment rules are what control how we assign findings to the remediation teams to take action on. As we review the assignment rules that we've configured, we can see something really important here. This shows us the type of exposure finding that this particular assignment rule pertains to. For example, CVIT for container vulnerable items, VIT for host infrastructure vulnerable items, AVIT for application vulnerable items, and CTR for configuration compliance and test results. This particular assignment rule here is quite notable, as we can see that this rule applies to all four of our current exposure types. Additionally, our USEM administrators can quickly toggle between all of the core USEM configurations, which apply to all of the exposure types, and manage this from within one seamless experience using the Security Exposure Management workspace. Let's continue as Carla and review our cloud exposure view. From the Security Exposure Management workspace, I'll proceed to click the cloud icon in my workspace navigator. We're presented with our cloud exposure view. This is a tailored experience that provides insights around all of our cloud exposures. For example, vulnerabilities on cloud container images, vulnerabilities on the hosts or serverless machines running the containers, as well as issues and misconfigurations within our cloud footprint. At the top, we have insights around the findings that require our attention, for example, unassigned findings or overdue findings. Down below, we have a breakdown of exposures as it pertains to a particular cloud resource type. For example, compute layer, network layer, storage layer, and so forth. We have a breakdown of exposure findings pertaining to container images and quick at-a-glance details around the severity or the risk rating, such as critical container image findings. And down below, we have a breakdown of our cloud exposures based on the particular cloud account. And we can see for a given cloud account, the types of exposure findings and granular details around the risk rating of the exposure finding, such as critical, high, and so forth. We have a breakdown of the cloud exposures based on the resource type. Here we have an illustration around our exposures as they pertain to top toxic combinations. For example, where we have a publicly exposed virtual machine or serverless host with high privileges. Next, we have a breakdown of our cloud exposures based on policies with the lowest compliance scores. I can click the View More button, and here I can see a listing of our policies with least compliance, as well as granular details on the number of failed findings by the risk rating. Thank you for your time reviewing the Unified Security Exposure Management experience. We saw how we can manage and report on all of our exposure types from within one unified experience. We saw we can take advantage of that same experience to manage all of our core configurations, manage the integrations, as well as rich experiences for some of our key personas, such as our exception approvers, remediation teams, as well as our cloud security teams. Thank you and take care.